Hello, and welcome back to the study of Job, brought to you each Wednesday night at 7 p.m. by the Port Huron Church of Christ, located at 756 17th Street, right here in the city of Port Huron. If you were with us on last week, we established a methodology which we're going to be using in studying this book. So, with that bit of business out of the way now, let's turn our attention to the introduction into the book of Job. Last week we talked about how we were going to eat the elephant, if you recall. Well, this week we're going to talk about the elephant itself. Now, before we do that, I want to preface the introduction with a brief statement to set the stage before we begin our examination of Job. In order to understand any biblical writing, there has to be some fundamental benchmarks that have to be established in order to fully understand the context of the writing of the book. The importance of placing a writing into its proper chronological setting connects the events of the writing to the known culture surrounding it, to events and other factors which ultimately influence the content of the writing. Case in point, think about when Paul was talking to us about Isaiah, and the events of Isaiah was being dependent upon factors that were going on around Isaiah, and all of the cultural things were playing into what Paul told us. This isn't like that. This is a little bit different from that. But you can see how the dating puts it in a place and time among a people. And that's what we're talking about here. So it's common to begin by establishing a time frame in which the work was written. So the first thing we want to consider is the dating of the writing of Job. So when was Job written? Well, that's a good question. In fact, as I mentioned last week, there's no definitive dating for the book. Now, since no actual dating is known, the best we can do is use clues to perhaps get us in the ballpark. But remember now, this only gets us close. So let's just do this for an exercise and see what we can glean from the first two chapters of the book of Job. In verse number 1 of chapter 1, we find that he worshiped a monotheistic God. Now, that's a long word, monotheistic. And in order to understand it, let's break it down into two parts. You have the word mono and theistic. Mono means one, and theistic is the word for God. So we're talking about a monotheistic God or one God. Now, it was common for men in various cultures back then to worship multiple gods, including among them the sun, the moon, the stars. Think, if you would, about Egypt. They worship thousands of gods, and even some places today, like in India, they worship many, many gods. But you know what was interesting? You find no mention of any of this in the book of Job. Throughout the book, he addresses a singular God and regards him, according to verse number 21, as the source of all things. Also, the second thing that we want to point out in verse number 1 is that the Bible said he shunned evil. Now, if you think about this, he worshiped one God and was diligent to that God, and he shunned evils. So a picture is beginning to emerge concerning Job and his practices. He realized, in order to please his God, that his life must be free of evil doing. And we're going to develop the importance of this thought a little later into the book. And that kind of brings us to another aspect of Job, and that's his practices. In verse number 5, it tells us that Job was the patriarch of his family as well as the priest of his family. Here it states that Job would offer sacrifices for his children in the event that they committed a sin against God. So I ask you the question, where did Job get the idea of doing this? Remember, he is offering he's sacrificing burnt offerings to God to purify his sons in case they sinned against God. Now, many theologians agree that Job was not an Israelite. First, because Job was from Uz, as the Bible says, and it's a land that's commonly believed as Edom. Secondly, there's no mention of the law anywhere in the book. And third, although some of the actions of Job mimic some of the actions of the Jews, there's not enough concrete evidence to conclude that Job was an Israelite. Let me give you an example of that in chapter 2, verse 13. It says, "Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was." If you're familiar with the Jewish ways and their culture, you know what they were doing, don't you? That's right. They were sitting Shiva. That's still done today. In our Western culture, when a person experiences a loss, the death of a loved one, friends and family come over, they bring food, and there's conversation, there's laughing, there's talking, all in an effort to cheer up the one that's mourning. And I'll tell you from experience, all they do is make it hard on the person that's mourning because they get tired of that. But in the Eastern culture, it's exactly the opposite. When the friends show up at the house of the mourner, they sit in total silence, and no one speaks a word until the mourner himself speaks first. You're going to find this is exactly what happened in Job 2:13, and it's exactly what happens today in our society. From this example, we can see why many theologians see Job as one of the oldest books in the Bible and place the timing of Job very close to the time of Abraham in Genesis because of the burnt offering situation. Now, some theologians even suggest what I call a super early dating for Job around the time of Genesis 10, which would place him between Noah and Abraham. But remember, this is, at best, a good educated guess. Now, my position on the dating of the book of Job is very, very simple. And this is where I am, and this is what I promised you on last week. If God wanted us to know, then he would have made it known. Therefore, in this case, for whatever reason, the dating of the book or lack of dating had no significant bearing on the message or the principles taught by the book. And I think, we can live with that. The second problem of the book of Job would be in its authorship. Once again, the author of this book remained silent and did not take credit for its content. However, many attribute the writing of Job to Moses or other Israelites primarily because of the influence of the word Yahweh in the writing of Job. This was mostly from the Jews. Another viewpoint that is not as popular is that Job himself was the writer. Again, just like the dating, if authorship was important, God would have made the author sign his name. Therefore, the absence of known authorship has no bearing on the message of the book. Now, early in the book, we are introduced to one of the main characters, a guy named Job. Up until this time, there's no mention of Job anywhere at any time. What makes this introduction interesting is the way in which he was introduced. Let's read it in chapter number 1, verses 1 through 3, as we find these words. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys. And he had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. Now, as you listen to this, I want you to know and recall that these verses contain critical information which will carry us through the account of Job. Therefore, we need to pause, I believe, and dissect what this opening statement is really suggesting. Now, if you recall from our discussion last week, we talked about whether or not Job was a real person and all of the people mentioned in the book real, or if they were all fictitious. One of the factors used to refute the argument that Job was a fictitious person is that the Bible doesn't say in a land far, far away, which could be anywhere, and would automatically denote in our minds, must be a fairy tale. No, in this case of Job, he lived in a place called Uz, which is a real place in ancient Edom, which today is exactly where southwestern Jordan is. So the fact that Uz is an actual place gives strong credence and presents a relatively strong argument to the possibility of Job being a real person. Now, before you hooray that and say, I get it, I agree, I'm with you, I'm on board, watch this now, because this is Bible study. And part of Bible study is analyzation and thinking. And in analyzing a thing, you ask yourself, could there be another reason or explanation for what I just read other than just the conclusion I have jumped to? And now listen, and here's the counterpoint to what we just read and concluded. Some argue the author intentionally used concrete places to make his fictitious characters lifelike, thus strengthening the point made by the principles taught in the book. So he uses us, and he uses that this guy was from here, this guy was from there. They did these things. So he's using this to make the principles taught, because he's believing they're all fictitious, and this makes his case stronger. So in this thinking, the detailed information are used more like a prop to support the narrative of the story. So I ask you again, which viewpoint do you think is the real viewpoint of the book of Job? Not so easy now, is it? No. So we have to take a side. We can't walk down the middle and, well, I guess we could if we wanted to, but I choose not to. So here's a statement that you've been waiting to hear. For the purpose of this study, to keep it as simple as we can and to really focus on the importance of the message and the principles of the message, we're going to take the leap of faith and we're going to make the assumption, right or wrong, that all of the participants in the book of Job are real and not fictitious. So, he lived in a place called Uz. What else can we learn about Job? Well, he was married and he had 10 children. Now, the Bible doesn't say he had 10 children, and it doesn't say anywhere in chapter 1 that he had a wife. Now, if he lived in 2020, it was a good possibility that he could have 10 children and no wife, but that's not the case. When we look at chapter 2 and turn to verse 9, we see Job in a conversation with his wife. So Job and his wife had 10 children. Well, that's not what the Bible said. He didn't have 10 children, not as such. See, that's how we would describe a person who had children. They would say, well, They're married and they have 6 children. But was that what the Bible said about Job? No. And there was a reason for that. So let's look and see exactly what it said. It said he had 7 boys and 3 girls. Now, fancy math tells you, yes, Lamar, those are 10 children, no matter how you cut it. But no, that's Western thinking. Let's put on our Eastern thinking caps and look at it from their perspective. And here's what you get. When a man had a son in the East, it was a good thing. When he had 2 sons, it was a blessing. So what do you think or believe 7 sons would equate to? God opening up heaven and raining the blessings of heaven into Job's life, because his wife didn't have 7 sons. God gave Job 7 sons and 3 daughters. God was the source and determiner of what Job was given. He could have just as well had 3 sons and 7 daughters. So the strength and power of this statement is the fact that this means something, that he had the 7 boys and the 3 girls. But that's not all. It says he was very wealthy. He had 7,000 sheep. He had 3,000 camel. He had 500 yoke of oxen, which, if you do some more fancy math, equates to 1,000 head, and 500 female donkeys, along with a large number of servants. Job had wealth. And you can see the mass of his wealth just through these statements here. But before the Bible talked about this, if you recall, it said something else about him that was very important. It said he was blameless, upright, feared God, and shunned evil. We can see this in our society, that most wealthy people really don't have a great devotion to God because they're devoted to their wealth. Remember, Jesus even mentioned, he says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So he recognized, and when he made that statement, that you're going to either love God or you're going to love money. He said, but you can't love both of them. It's just impossible. And you're going to serve one against the other. So in this case, you would think with such a mass amount of wealth that Job would be a man that would serve his wealth, but not so. The emphasis is put on him being blameless, upright, his fear of God, and shunning of evil. Now, we've talked about many of these, but let me touch just for a moment on what it means that he feared God, because that denotes different things in different people's minds. Some people see the fear of God is that he was in fright, image of frightened of God, just terrified of God's presence. But that's not the word here that's used. It means a reverential fear, a fear that revered God, a fear that saw God as this wonderful, awesome God that he is, much like we do today. Now, there are moments, and I think for all of us, if we were to die in our sleep and wake up in the presence of God, I think that we would be a little frightened and intimidated by that scene. But that's not the intimidation that we live in, and certainly not the motive for us worshiping and serving God. That's not it. We worship him because of his greatness, because of who he is, not because we're afraid of what he can do to us. That's an entirely different subject. So this tells us, in the 4th aspect of Job, it took all of this into account and summed it up in one statement, that he was the greatest, richest man among all the people of the East. To all the known world at the time, this was the guy that was not only the most wealthy, he was the one that was most upright and devoted to God with his life. Now, it's important to make a mental note of this list because in a few verses, it will define Job and become the fuel which, when ignited, will launch us into the book. But before we do that, we need to look at the unique structure of the book of Job. The structure found in this book is not found in any other book in the Bible. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that this won't be the most enjoyable read you will have in the Bible. Allow me to explain. Job probably comes in a close second to the book of Leviticus. I hear a lot of people complain about Leviticus. I personally love the book, but a lot of people say that reading Leviticus is like trudging through mud. And the reason what makes Job so difficult to read is, well, let me just give you an example, okay? This is the way that we normally read in the West. Our books are mostly written in a narrative style. There's a beginning, there's a storyline, and there's an ending. And this all fits together. Sometimes the author will take the ending and set it at the beginning, and then make you watch how it unfolds to get to the very beginning. He just reverses the order. But normally there's a natural progression from the beginning to the end of the book. That's what we're accustomed to. And most of the writings in the Bible are written in this way, and you just kind of follow it. There are some that are not, but most of them are. Let me show you what Job looks like under a microscope, how different it is. So when we talk about the structure of the book of Job, we're talking about two major parts of Job. One is poetry and the other one is prose. Now let me talk about these for just a moment. You have, in its structure, you have a prologue, and I'll explain that. You have a dialogue of arguments, and you have an epilogue at the back end of Job. This is called prose. It's written in the narrative. So it begins here and it ends here. This one begins here and ends here. That's the narrative part of the book. The prologue not only introduces the book, it sets up the scene of the book in a way that without this prologue, we would have no idea what's going on right here. We would be totally lost, as was Job. And the only advantage we have to Job as we read the book is because the prologue gives the whole thing away. It sets up the scene and now says, you start here, reader, and watch it unfold all the way to here. Okay? So we have the prologue. The epilogue is another narrative that comes in at the end of Job. And let me just say this. The prologue is chapters 1 and 2. The epilogue is chapter 42, verses 7 through 17. It's 10 verses long is the epilogue, the ending of it, which is also written in the narrative. But guess what's in the middle? You got it. Chapters 3 through 42, verse 6, are poetry. And I'm going to tell you something. That's a lot of poetry. That's more poetry than most of us really want to read. And it's not easy to read poetry if you don't have a great love for it. So the way this is designed, and the reason why I designed this way is because this section here, these arguments are written in 3 cycles. Job is going to have 3 friends that are going to show up and talk to him about his problem. We're going to find that out. It starts in chapter 3. And with each of these friends, Job is going to speak. The friend is going to speak. The first friend, Job's going to speak again and address him. Then the next friend is going to address Job. And then Job's going to address him. And we do that for 3 cycles, although only 2 of the friends go the entire 3 cycles. One guy, Zophar, only goes 2 of the cycles, and then another guy comes in and completes the cycle and literally talks for 5 chapters. Really interesting, and we'll talk about Elihu and his influence later. But this is what the book looks like when you kind of lay out the book of Job. It's full of poetry, and a little bit of prose on each end. And I'll tell you, by the time you get out of here, you're really happy to see this show up again, because that's the way that we read in the West. So within the structure, the reason why it's written this book this way is that the Bible has a classification called wisdom literature. And wisdom literature contains the books of Proverbs, there's Psalm, Ecclesiastes, Job, and Solomon. So the fact that Job is considered within the wisdom literature may serve as a basis for the argument for those that want to say that all of the participants in the book are fictitious. So as I showed you, the book is broken into 3 major parts. And before we begin the first chapter, I think I need to alert you to something that I think may make a difference, or I'm going to take a different course. And I need you to understand that, because I'm not going to take the course through the book maybe that you would think I would. We read the book and we just take everything at face value without giving it a lot of thought. And I think we do Job a disservice. So because of that, I'm going to pursue a course that I am convinced presents a natural transitional flow, easy for me to say, and speaks to the true issue and purpose of the book. Now, I want to just put this disclaimer out there. If after I have explained this and you don't agree with me, that's perfectly fine. If you want to have another approach and you want to abandon what I say, I'm fine with this. But I want you to at least consider, as you study the Bible, the possibility of another viewpoint that differs from what you always thought the book meant or the book said. At least consider it. And in your consideration of it, evaluate the argument. Evaluate the points that are made, not the fact, because you know what? Most of what we understand from the Bible, we get either from a pulpit or other sources that have told us what it means. But very little of it comes from our personal Bible study. So I'm asking you, before you say Lamar's crazy and throw it away, I want you to give thought to it. I want you to look at it, and maybe there's a possibility that you may learn something and see something that you never saw before. And that's what Bible study does. It teaches us how to look, and how to look beyond what we see without assuming anything, and to glean the message that the book really is trying to portray to us. Now, after you've done all of this, if you want to take an entirely different course, you're perfectly fine to do so. I just ask that you do one thing, and that's to make sure that wherever you land in your final position, that is based on what you read in the Bible and not just what you've heard. I'm trying to break paradigms as we study this and free our thinking to accept and contemplate other legitimate possibilities. Okay? What you come up with and accept is your reality. That's strictly up to you. That's the strength of Bible study. All right. With all of that said, guess what time it is? It's time to go home. Yep. Tomorrow or next week, I keep saying tomorrow. Next week, we will begin looking at chapter 1. We will start with our intro, and we would go on our journey now through the book of Job. I think that we've laid enough of a foundation to an understanding that this is going to be a different study. And we understand that it's written in a way that's going to be a little strange to us. And I'm going to try to take these statements, and just instead of reading all 42 chapters of the book, you can do that by yourself, as I've asked you to already be doing in the process of doing. I want to look at the statements that summarize what each guy is saying and how it fits into the big picture of what's going on in the book of Job. Our goal, remember, is to understand the purpose that God has given us to Job. And then I want to give you one more thought as we go through this. Your theology of God is going to be challenged. Your understanding of the book of Job is going to be challenged. Your theology of God is going to be challenged. But you know what? That's what Bible study is for. And at the end of this, you will not only believe what you believe, you will know why you believe it, you will stand on what you believe, and you will be able to defend what you believe. And that is what God is expecting of all of us. So with all of that said, again, we want to thank you for joining us. We've had a wonderful time together today. I just hope that you have found a lot of good information. I pray that you're reading the book of Job and preparing for a wonderful study as we analyze this very difficult poetic writing in the book of Job. Until then, be safe. We'll see you right here next week. May God bless you.